All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. We're coming to the end as we're in the server-side website programming area, and we're talking Express Web Framework with Node.js and JavaScript. We're in the tutorial, and we're in part 5 of 7, and you'll notice when you look at this, it says we're now ready to add the pages. The pages will include a home page that shows how many records we have of each model type, and a list and detail pages for all of our models. Along the way, we'll gain practical experience in getting records from the database. And when you notice, this doesn't look like it's a very long section, and it's because what they've done, because that's it, is they've got each page in its own subarticle. All right. So the author says here in our previous tutorial articles, we defined mongoose models that we can use to interact with a database and created some initial records. We then created all of the routes with the dummy functions, the dummy controller functions, skeletons, whatever you want to call them. So the next step, as mentioned there, is to provide proper implementations for the pages that display our library information. This includes updating the controller functions to fetch records, using our models and defining templates to display the information to users. We will start by providing an overview primer explaining how to manage asynchronous operations in controller functions and how to write templates using Pug. Then we'll provide implementations for each of our main read-only pages with a brief explanation of any special or new features. At the end of this, you should have a good end-to-end understanding of how routes, asynchronous views, and models work in practice. Now, it looks like we're going to have 12 different articles here. So what I think I'm going to do, even if they're short, I don't know if they will be or not. I haven't looked at these yet. So I'm going to do each one of these starting here in its own lesson. All right. But since I've only 2 minutes in, I'm just going to make the first lesson include this one right here. So again, we'll come back in and do each one in their own thing. So the following subarticles go through the process of adding the different features required for us to display the required website pages. You need to read and work through each one of these in turn before moving on to the next one. So that'll be it for in here. But let's just start with asynchronous flow control using async. Now, this very well could go back to things that we've talked about in earlier, some of this will be stuff I believe that we talked about in earlier lessons. So the controller code for some of our local library pages will depend on the results of multiple asynchronous requests, which may be required to run either in a particular order or in parallel. In order to manage the flow of control and render the pages correctly, we'll use the popular Node async module. And if you remember, that's something that we added a long time ago. All right, we installed it. There are a number of other ways to manage asynchronous behavior and flow control in JavaScript, such as promises. All right. Async has a lot of useful methods. Some of the most important ones include async.parallel, as it says, to execute any operations that must be performed in parallel. Async.series, for when we need to ensure that asynchronous operations are performed in series. And Async.Waterfall, for operations that must run in series with each operation depending on the results of the preceding operations. Most of the methods we use in Express are asynchronous. You specify an operation to perform and you pass in a callback. The method returns immediately, but the callback is not invoked, basically until the required or requested operation completes. By convention in Express, and you've seen this before, callback functions pass an error value as the first parameter, and that will be null if it's successful, and it'll have a value in it if it wasn't successful, and the results in the second parameter. And again, the results, if it's successful, will hold your information, and if not successful, will hold null. If a controller only needs to perform one asynchronous operation to get the information required to render a page, then the implementation is easy. We render the template in the callback. The code fragment below shows this code that renders a count of some model using the Mongoose count documents. All right, so right there. Says, what if you need to make multiple asynchronous queries and you can't render the page until all have completed? A native application could daisy chain the requests, kicking off subsequent requests in the callback of a previous request, and rendering the response in the final callback. But there's a problem with this, as mentioned right here. Our requests would have to be run in series, even though it might be more efficient to run them in parallel. As it says, this can also result in what we've talked about earlier as callback hell. A much better solution would be to execute all the requests in parallel and then have a single callback that executes when all of these have completed. It says this sort of operations make the async much easier. The method async.parallel is used to run multiple asynchronous operations in parallel with one another. The first argument is a collection of functions to run. Could be an array or something else. Each object is passed a callback, again with that error and result that we talked about previously. All right, which it must call on completion with an error, which can be null, and an optional results value. The optional second argument to async.parallel is a callback that will be run when all of the functions in the first argument have completed. The callback is invoked when an error argument and a result collection that contains the results of the individual async operations. The result collection is of the same type as the first argument. If any of them report an error, the callback is invoked early with the error value. The example below shows how this works. They're just using numbers here. If you instead pass an array of functions as the first arguments, the results will be in an array. Okay. All right. The method async.series is used to run multiple asynchronous operations in sequence when subsequent operations do not depend on the output of earlier functions. It is essentially declared and behaves the same way as async parallel. It looks very similar as well. Kind of an important note here on the top of the page, as it says, ECMA, again, remember that's the European Computer Manufacturing Association, the governing body of JavaScript. So the ECMA or JavaScript language spec states that the order of an enumeration of objects is undefined. So it's possible that functions will not be called in the same order they're specified. If the order is important, you should pass an array as shown below, because then when you iterate through the array, it should go in the right order. The method async.waterfall is used to run multiple asynchronous operations in sequence when each is dependent on the result of the previous. So it's more or less what we're talking about is the input to operation 2 would depend on the output from operation 1, and then the output from operation 2 would be the input into operation 3, etc. The callback invoked by each asynchronous function contains null for the first argument and results in subsequent arguments. Each function takes the results arguments of the previous callback and the first parameters and then a callback function. When all operations are complete, a final callback is invoked with the result of the last operation. And they show an example right here. All right, I think we've already done this. I think we did an npm install async, but in fact, we can check. We should be able to check by going in, finding our file right here, and opening up our package.json and seeing if we've got that in there or not. And there's async. Could put it in again. I don't see at all what that buys us, but I think that that's what they show in here. All right, so I'm going to return to part 5. And we have now gone through, in these 12 parts that are in here, part 1, the asynchronous flow control using async. So next we will look at the template primer, go through that momentarily.